$21,949,322,806,534. At least that's what it was yesterday, about 1:15 in the afternoon, according to the National Debt Clock. But the numbers were spinning so fast, I really couldn't even stay up with them or write them down quick enough. This works out to about $179,464 per taxpayer, or about $856,000 per family that we owe as a nation. But of course, that's not the whole of it. The average American household carries $137,063 in personal debt as well. And no doubt some of us wish we were more average than we are. Ronald Reagan used to joke that the national debt is big enough to actually take care of itself. That's back when it was only $3 trillion. But we're not exactly removed from this, even in our church. It pales in comparison with the national numbers, yes. But last year, despite underspending our budget by over $200,000, we still ended up spending about $88,000 more than we received, which is part of why we cut the budget some for this year and may cut it just a bit more. Now, truth is, things happen. They happen to all of our families. They happen to church families too. But they shouldn't happen all the time, should they? Billy Graham used to say that if your ox falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, you should pull it out. But if it falls into that ditch every Sabbath, you should either fill in the ditch or get a new ox. All of which is why we want to talk a little bit this morning about a subject which all of us have to deal with, but a lot of us want to do so only in private. That is the question of how we manage our finances in life, both personal and corporate. Now, some of you are already thinking, I know, what business is it of the church how I conduct my financial affairs? But the answer is, it's completely our business. Because nobody who's ever really followed Jesus Christ hasn't likewise sooner or later had to confront the question of how they handle their money. This is why, as we suggested last week, Jesus talked about money so much. I know some of you think preachers only talked about money. Well, you would not have liked Jesus. 1 out of every 6 recorded sayings, 1 out of every 3 parables he told had to do with money. Jesus understood that's important to us. So it was important to him as well. We talked about it as well because, at least if a survey done by one group is correct, 80% of all Americans are stressed about the economy and their personal finances. 52% of us lay awake at night worrying about it. So surely our faith should address such a situation, shouldn't it? What then does the Lord have to say about our finances this morning? What would he have us consider, whether we happen to be flushed right now or broke as a joke? Well, I want to cue from scriptures, and I want to suggest the biblical advice on this matter can be summed up in just 4 key words. If you want to write them down, you can do so either in the margin of your Bible right here in this passage, or on your bulletin, or depending upon which is more appropriate, on an offering envelope or on a prayer card. 4 simple words: Lord, work, debt, and give. Will you say them with me? Lord, work, debt, give. First one is clearly the most important one. It's a reminder that our God truly is the Lord of all, including our finances. It's cardinal tenet of Scripture. God both possesses and presides over all of the wealth in this world and in the next. We find this idea way back in Chronicles 29, a prayer which David offers when the people brought so much money. Get this, the people brought so much money to rebuild the temple, they had to ask them to stop bringing money. In 44 years of being a pastor, I've never had to do that. No, really, stop giving. We have too much. David said, everything in heaven and on earth is yours. Yours, O Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hand are strength and power to exalt and give strength unto all. Likewise, we see the idea in the Psalms. Psalmist said, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. We heard in St. Paul's words to the Romans too, for from him and through him and to him are all things. So who has ever given to God that God should repay him? You want to get right down to it. The whole shebang, the whole world, all of its possessions, even all those complex monetary systems which people have constructed all over the centuries and talk about in places like Davos, Switzerland. It all belongs to him. He is Lord over all. That's why we are dead wrong whenever we think that we really can't do some things in our lives or in our church because we can't afford them. Because in reality, if those things truly are of God, that's what he's called us to do, there's no question he can afford anything, can't he? If he chooses to. And all of God's wealth legally belongs to his children. Romans 8:17 tells us we have been made joint heirs with Christ. Does that sound pretty good, huh? Joint heirs with Christ. Consider what being a joint heir means. Before my mom died, I managed her finances. She was in her late 80s, and her checkbook was a perpetual disaster. I could never make heads or tails of it, and she didn't know either. So I became a joint tenant on all of her accounts. I put them online so I could watch them more carefully and not have to deal with her checkbook. I'll share with this little tidbit with some of you before. The very first week I checked on my mom's checking account, I noticed she had made a purchase with her bank card at Hooters. She was 85 years old. So I said, Mom, did you go to Hooters? She said, yes. Some of the girls and I went after Sunday school. I didn't really like the food. I didn't have to hard tell her, Mom, nobody goes for the food, okay? I did start watching her accounts more regularly to see what else she was up to. Felt responsible because I was a joint account holder. Like a joint heir, it meant that I needed to act as a steward of those resources, not as the one who owned them, but as somebody who helped to manage them on behalf of their true owner. In a sense, that's what we all are when it comes under God's wealth. In the Greek language of the New Testament, the word that is used repeatedly in this context is the term oikomenos. It comes from oikos, meaning house, and menos as the ruler. It's the ruler of the house, the chief servant. It's from the word oikomenos that our word economy comes from, but also our word ecumenical. A good steward of God's house is somebody who practices good economy. But it begins by recognizing that all material goods ultimately belong unto God. He is Lord over all, right? So what are we supposed to do to bring ourselves in alignment with this Lord who owns the cattle of 1,000 hills and everything else? That brings us to the second word for the morning. And it really is a 4-letter word to some folks, I think. It's the word work. This passage from this morning makes abundantly clear. Work in some form or fashion is supposed to be a part of all of our lives in the Lord. So much so that Paul will even go so far as to lay down a rule for his followers that if a person will not work, they shall not eat. Some of the people in the church had caught on to the fact that others would care for them out of their Christian love. They began to take advantage of that. They begin to not work and just live off the charity of their sisters and their brothers. And Paul said, that just can't be. Now, to be sure, not everybody's work will produce a paycheck. Some folks' work will be far different from other people's work. Some may work in the home. Others may work for free as a volunteer, rendering significant service. Some may have retired from their active careers, and now they're about helping their grandchildren. Some may have a disability that has changed the character of their work to that of now being intercession for other people. All that's okay. But in one way or the other, what the Bible tells us that each of us ought to be dutifully engaged in some fashion, making a contribution to the common good of all. Now, people who like measuring things will tell you that work itself can be measured in a unit called a foot-pound, which relates to the effort it takes to lift 1 pound, 1 foot. That doesn't really tell the story, though, does it? You could strain until you gave out trying to lift a heavy trunk or something and still not receive any credit for actually working. While technically speaking, if you merely lift a feather 1 inch, it can be said measurably that you've worked. This is why the idea of work generally does not lend itself well to comparisons. Now, I'll be candid. I don't really understand what half of you here do all week long. I don't understand that. I never have. My brother worked, he's a little older, he worked for years. I never knew what he did. He told me 3 or 4 times, but I didn't get it. Our son works as the director of government affairs for Air Liquide, a large French company. And he goes to Washington and he talks to people and he goes back and forth. And finally, after about a year, I said, "Are you a lobbyist?" He said, "Well, I did have to register." I said, "Our son is a registered lobbyist? How did that happen in our family? We're good people." I don't know. I don't understand what other people do. But I suspect you don't know what a preacher does, right? Sounds like a cushy job. Work 1 day a week, really just a few hours. And then sit around and try to look spiritual the rest of the time. Most folks don't actually get this. We don't have to understand what anybody else's work is. We just have to understand that whether it is for pay or not, whether it is physically exhausting or it's mentally taxing or not, God's plan for all of us while we are on this earth is that at least in some capacity, which is commensurate with our abilities and our health, that we work. That's why Paul goes so far as to say, stay away from those who are idle. Literally, in the Greek text, those who are atoptos, that is disorderly or unpredictably, just simply idly walking around unpredictably, going nowhere, just hanging around with no purpose. Paul says we ought to pay our own way in life so that we don't become a burden, that we don't weigh down somebody else. And what if you can't find a job? That's a tough question. It's a difficult time in our society. Many corporations have downsized, and they have dropped even the last pretense of being truly concerned for the long-term security of their workers. Enormous greed within the corporate structure of many businesses have created places in which the number one priority is not towards serving customers or clients or even producing a reasonable profit for stockholders. It is for simply preserving the personal privileges and at times outrageous prerogatives of the upper management. If there's any more blatant illustration of what sin truly is, I don't know what it is than the presence and practice of greed like that. But still, insofar as it lies with us, Paul says God's calling for each of us is that we labor, we kopos, just as Paul did. And the force of that word is a really strong one in the Greek language. It implies that we work hard, not that we hardly work. A lot more to do with our attitude and our aptitude in life. See, working is essentially particularly important if you're to heed the third principle, which is that insofar as is possible, eliminate debt in your life. And that's a hard word to hear, I suspect. We said at the beginning, few people are not at least somewhat in debt, if only for their home or their cars. And the point is not that we should never finance out something when that makes sense and we have the resources. But if we are in debt so much as to cause us anxiety, to borrow the question asked of every Methodist preacher when they're ordained, so as to embarrass us in our work, we need to take some steps to actually change that. Get into the Dave Ramsey course. It begins this Thursday. Figure out how you can make a plan. Set aside some every month. Try to keep from falling further and further into that black hole. Begin to practice some patience in your life, especially when it comes to impulse purchases. See, it's really very simple, isn't it? When your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep is your downfall. Which brings us to the last word we might share this morning. That's the word give. You thought, oh, I knew we'd get to that. He's a preacher. Let me tell you, though, it might make little human sense to us. The way to appropriate God's wealth is to give. Luke 6:38 tells us, in fact, that if we give, it will be given to us. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured unto you. It sounds almost aerobic to me. And we're not talking about health and wealth or prosperity gospel here. Just simple physics and posture. When you give, your hand is open. You can also receive. Our God is more than willing to meet all of our needs as we're more than willing to trust him. So how much should you give? The biblical model often cited is the tithe, or 10%. And over the years, countless people have asked me, well, is that gross or net, preacher? My response has been, well, do you want to be a gross disciple or a net disciple? Few of us in this church are at the tithing level. I know that. I can see what we do on that. And some have said that at least according to the New Testament, Christians are no longer required to tithe, and I think that's actually true. We're not under the Mosaic law per se as believers in Christ, but I believe it still sets a good benchmark for us. And if you're not there, you may want to take it in some simple incremental steps. Do the math. And if you are giving 1 or 2% of your income, try to give 2 or 3%. Just bump it up a little bit. Let me be clear too, it doesn't all come to the church. Julie and I give the bulk of our contributions here, yes. But it's not the only place. We support all kinds of missions, and even individuals that we think have special needs. The point is not really where does your giving go, it's that does your giving go? Does it go out from you to help somebody else? I would be okay if you tithe and not any of it comes here. Because what that would say to me is that you are trusting God. And you want to do good for him. It's not about this church getting money. It's about us learning how to be responsible in this. Julie and I began tithing when we first were married. My salary in my first church was about $3,700 a year. A year. I thought I was doing great. I'd been in seminary. I didn't have any money then. And we tithed it. Thanks to your generosity, I make a whole lot more than that now. But we still tithe it. And more. Because this is how we've learned over the years. This is what we can do to be faithful on our part. And we found God is always faithful on his part. So with respect to the church, we're going to ask each of our members and contributing friends to think about this enough to be able to write down an estimate, not a guarantee, not a contract, just an estimate of how much you would hope to be able to give in 2019 to Christ Church. And that's for one reason only, so that we can plan wisely as a church and not overspend, which doesn't glorify God. This is the balancing act for all of us. I know how to be prudent and to be reasonable on the one hand, how to be faithful and trust God on the other. I can tell you that whenever we've stepped out to try to do more, God has never failed us. Giving and giving generously is a part of God's financial plan for our lives. And if you haven't learned how to do that yet, how to give proportionately, that is in accordance with your income, not just in accordance with what you happen to have in your wallet one day, and also systematically, that is regularly and disciplined, and cheerfully, without a sense of compulsion or guilt, out of a sense of privilege and response. I simply suggest to you, you are never really going to be in control of your finances. They will always control you. Cheerfully. That's what Paul says. Hilariously is the actual word he uses. I have to confess to you, I'm okay if you're a little bit grumpy when you write the check. I can live with that, okay? But I really want you not to live with that. I really want you to feel this privilege. Who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously unto the Lord? So, Lord, work, debt, and give. Simple words. They constitute some powerful biblical advice for anybody who wants to be a better steward, a better okumenos, a better economist in their life and in their faith. So what do you want to be this morning? If you're feeling a bit trapped by your circumstances, maybe you could remember this. 2 men looked out of prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. What do you see this morning?